The gas lamps flickered weakly through the thick fog that had descended upon Whitechapel's cobblestone streets, their dim light barely piercing the oppressive darkness of the November evening. The year was 1888, and fear still lingered in every shadow, in every corner of this forsaken part of London. Isla Roberts, a gaunt woman with hollow cheeks and tired eyes, pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as she hurried through the narrow alley. The bitter wind howled through the cramped passages between the decrepit buildings, carrying with it the stench of poverty and despair that had become synonymous with these streets. At 42, Isla had seen more than her share of hardship. Widowed 3 years prior when her husband succumbed to consumption, she had watched helplessly as their modest life crumbled around her. Now, like so many others in Whitechapel, she survived on the margins of society, invisible to the wealthy who hurried past in their fine carriages, averting their eyes from the misery that plagued these streets. But tonight was different. The fog seemed alive, writhing with malevolent purpose, and the familiar streets felt alien and threatening. Isla's heart pounded against her ribcage as she quickened her pace, her worn boots clicking against the wet cobblestones. The sound echoed off the buildings, creating an unsettling chorus that seemed to follow her every move. A low, guttural laugh cut through the silence like a knife. Isla froze, her breath catching in her throat. The laugh had come from somewhere behind her, but when she whirled around, she saw only the swirling fog. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling, despite her attempt at courage. Only the whisper of the wind answered, the gas lamp above. Her head sputtered and dimmed, casting wild shadows that danced across the brick walls. In that moment, Isla felt it, a presence heavy and watchful, pressing down on her with almost physical weight. She wasn't alone in this alley, though she desperately wished she were. "You saw him, didn't you?" The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once, deep and threatening, yet somehow familiar in a way that made her blood run cold. Isla's legs felt leaden, rooted to the spot, as a tall figure emerged from the fog ahead. He wore a long black coat, his face hidden beneath the brim of a top hat, but there was something about his posture that spoke of barely contained violence. I don't know what you mean," Isla managed to whisper, though her heart screamed at her to run. But where could she go? These were Jack the Ripper's hunting grounds, and everyone knew his victims never escaped. The figure took a step closer, and the fog seemed to part around him like a dark curtain. "You're different, Isla," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried clearly through the night air. "You know more than you should. You've heard stories, seen things." A memory flickered at the edges of her consciousness. Something she had tried to forget, something she had buried deep within her mind. But what was it? The more she tried to grasp it, the more it slipped away, like trying to catch smoke with bare hands. "How do you know my name?" she demanded, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. The figure chuckled, and the sound made her skin crawl. "I know everything about you, Isla Roberts. I know about the nightmares that wake you screaming. I know about the memories you've locked away." He took another step forward, and now she could see his face in the flickering lamplight. The scars that crossed his features were like deep furrows in ancient wood, and his eyes, God help her, his eyes were empty, like looking into the abyss itself. "I am a reflection of you, Isla," he murmured, his words carrying a weight that seemed to press against her very soul. The real question is, are you ready to face what you've hidden inside yourself? The words struck her like a physical blow. Memories began to surface. Fractured images of a night years ago, screams in the darkness, blood on cobblestones. She had seen something, hadn't she? Something she wasn't supposed to see, something she had forced herself to forget. The man turned away, his coat swirling in the fog like wings of darkness. The legend of Jack the Ripper is more alive than ever, he called over his shoulder, his voice echoing off the narrow walls. And you, Isla, have a part to play. As he disappeared into the darkness, Isla remained frozen, her mind reeling from the encounter. The fog curled around her ankles like ghostly fingers, and the gas lamps cast strange shadows that seemed to whisper secrets she wasn't ready to hear. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to her core that her life had just changed irrevocably. The truth was out there, buried in the depths of her forgotten memories, and now it was clawing its way to the surface. The man's words echoed in her mind. You have a part to play. But what part, and why her? As she finally found the strength to move, hurrying through the darkened streets toward her modest lodgings, Isla couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide observant eyes, and every sound made her jump. The familiar streets of Whitechapel had become a maze of terror, and somewhere in the darkness, Jack the Ripper was waiting. What had she seen on that forgotten night? And more importantly, what had she forgotten? The answers lay somewhere in the depths of her memory, but Isla feared that remembering might cost her more than she was willing to pay. Yet somehow, she knew she no longer had a choice. The game had begun, and she was now an unwitting player in a deadly dance with London's most notorious killer. As she finally reached her lodgings and bolted the door behind her, Isla sank to the floor, her entire body trembling. The man's words kept repeating in her mind over and over, I am a reflection of you. What did he mean? What connection could she possibly have to Jack the Ripper? The night pressed in around her, full of secrets and shadows, and somewhere in the darkness, a killer waited. The truth was coming, whether she was ready for it or not. Dawn broke over London like a grey shroud, the weak November sun struggling to pierce the perpetual fog that cloaked Whitechapel. Isla hadn't slept. How could she after what had happened? Her encounter with the mysterious figure had left her, shaken to her very core, his words echoing in her mind like a funeral dirge. The legend of Jack the Ripper is more alive than ever, and you, Isla, have a part to play. She sat at her small window watching as the streets below came to life. Workers hurried past, heads down, collars turned up against the biting cold. Street vendors began setting up their stalls, their calls echoing off the grimy buildings. Everything seemed normal, mundane even, but to Isla, the world had shifted on its axis. Nothing would ever be the same again. With trembling hands, she reached for the small mirror on her dresser. The face that stared back at her was familiar, yet somehow foreign. The same hollow cheeks and tired eyes she'd grown accustomed to, but now they seemed to hold secrets she couldn't quite grasp. A reflection of you, the man had said. What did he mean? What connection could she possibly have to London's most notorious killer? A sudden knock at her door made her jump, the mirror slipping from her grasp and shattering on the wooden floor. 7 years of bad luck, her mother would have said, but Isla felt as though her luck had already run out. She approached the door cautiously, her heart thundering in her chest. "Who's there?" No answer came, but when she finally gathered the courage to open the door, she found a small wooden box sitting on the threshold. It was old, the wood darkened with age, and a familiar symbol was carved into its lid. A symbol that made her head spin with half-remembered nightmares. Her hands shook as she picked it up, quickly retreating back into her room and bolting the door. The box felt heavy in her hands, heavier than its size would suggest. Inside, she found a yellowed envelope, the paper brittle with age. The handwriting was elegant but rushed, as if written in great haste. "You know what happened that night. Everyone knows Whitechapel's secret cannot be buried. It's in your hands now." Below the note was a newspaper clipping dated September 30th, 1888. The headline screamed in bold type, "Double event shocks Whitechapel, 2 more victims of the Ripper." But it was the smaller article beneath that caught her eye, one she'd never seen before, despite her obsessive reading of every Ripper article she could find. "Young woman witnesses horror memory loss claimed." The room seemed to spin as Isla read the article. It described a woman who had been found wandering the streets near Mitre Square on the night of the double murders, her clothes splattered with blood that wasn't her own. When questioned, she claimed to have no memory of what had happened. The woman's name wasn't given, but Isla felt a cold certainty settling in her bones. It had been her. Memories began to surface, like corpses rising from the depths of the Thames. Flashes of that night running through fog-shrouded streets, the metallic smell of blood, a figure in a long black coat. But why couldn't she remember more? What had she seen that was so terrible? Her mind had chosen to lock it away. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside her room made her freeze. They were heavy, deliberate, stopping right outside her door. Isla held her breath, clutching the newspaper clipping to her chest. The floorboards creaked, and a shadow appeared in the gap beneath her door. "Time to remember, Isla," a voice whispered. The same voice from the night before. "The past won't stay buried forever." She backed away from the door, her legs hitting the edge of her bed. The shadow remained, a dark presence that seemed to seep into the room like poison gas. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, leaving only the sound of retreating footsteps and the thundering of her own heart. With trembling fingers, Isla spread the newspaper clipping on her small table. There was something else in the box, a small key, ancient and rusted, with an address etched into its handle: 14 Dorset Street, Spitalfields. She knew that address. Everyone in Whitechapel did. It was where Mary Jane Kelly, the Ripper's last known victim, had met her brutal end. But there was something else about that address. Something tugging at the edges of her consciousness. A memory trying to break free from whatever chains her mind had bound it with. She had been there before, hadn't she? Not just passing by, but inside those walls. But when and why? The morning light was growing stronger now, casting long shadows across her small room. Isla knew she had a choice to make. She could try to forget again, to push these memories back into the darkness where they had lurked for so long, or she could face them, follow this twisted path to wherever it might lead. Bitter laugh escaped her lips. It wasn't really a choice at all, was it? The man in black had made that clear enough. She was already part of this story, had been for years without knowing it. The only way forward was through the darkness. Gathering what little courage she had left, Isla dressed quickly, tucking the key and the newspaper clipping into her pocket. The streets of Whitechapel awaited, and somewhere in their twisted maze lay answers to questions she hadn't even known to ask. But as she reached for the door handle, a thought struck her with the force of a physical blow. What if she wasn't just a witness to the Ripper's crimes? What if she had been something more? The fog outside her window seemed to thicken, as if responding to her dark thoughts. Somewhere in the distance, church bells began to toll, their mournful sound echoing. Through the streets, like a warning, Isla took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and stepped out into the grey morning. The past was calling, and it was time to answer. Little did she know that by the end of this day, everything she thought she knew about herself, about Jack the Ripper, and about the very nature of evil would be turned upside down. The truth was waiting in the shadows of Whitechapel, and it was far more terrifying than anything she could have imagined. The streets of Spitalfields were already crowded. As Isla made her way toward Dorset Street, market traders called out their wares in Cockney accents, while workers rushed past with cloth-wrapped lunches tucked under their arms. The normality of it all felt like a cruel joke after the revelations of the morning. The rusty key seemed to burn in her pocket, a constant reminder of the horror that awaited. Dorset Street, Miller's Court, the place where Mary Jane Kelly had breathed her last. The most brutal of all the Ripper's murders had happened behind those walls, and now something was drawing Isla there, pulling her toward a truth she wasn't sure she wanted to face. As she approached the building, the bustling sounds of the market began to fade, as if she were walking into a bubble of silence. The old wooden door stood before her, its paint peeling, the number 14 barely visible. Her hands trembled as she withdrew the key from her pocket. It shouldn't work. The locks must have been changed countless times since 1888. Yet when she inserted it into the lock, it turned with an ominous click. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow hallway that seemed to absorb what little light filtered through the grimy windows. The floorboards groaned beneath her feet as she stepped inside, and the air was thick with the musty smell of decay and forgotten memories. I wondered when you'd come. The voice made her spin around. In the shadows stood the old woman from the market, her weathered face grave, but there was something different about her now. Her eyes seemed to glow with an inner light that made Isla's skin crawl. "Who are you?" Isla demanded, her voice barely more than a whisper. "What do you know about all this?" The old woman's lips curved into a sad smile. "I am Margaret Nagle, and I've been waiting for you for a very long time, child. Since that night in 1888 when you saw what no living soul was meant to see." Isla's head began to throb as fragments of memory tried to surface. I can't remember." "No, you wouldn't," Margaret said softly. "Your mind protected you the only way it could. But now it's time to remember, Isla. The truth can't stay buried forever." She reached out and touched Isla's forehead with gnarled fingers that felt ice cold. The world exploded into darkness, and suddenly Isla wasn't standing in the hallway anymore. She was running through the fog-shrouded streets of Whitechapel. But it was 1888, and the cobblestones were slick with blood. In the memory, she saw herself younger, terrified, ducking into an alleyway as heavy footsteps approached. She watched as a man in a long black coat walked past her hiding place, something glinting in his hand. But it wasn't the knife that made her gasp. It was his face, a face she knew, as well as her own. "No," Isla whispered, pulling away from Margaret's touch. The vision shattered, leaving her back in the present, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. "It can't be, he's dead. They told me he was dead." "Your father?" Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. "Yes, Thomas Roberts died in Newgate Prison in 1886, or at least that's what they wanted everyone to believe." The room seemed to spin as pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Thomas Roberts, the father she had tried so hard to forget, the man who had disappeared from her life when she was just a child, leaving her mother to raise her alone, the man who had been arrested for a series of brutal attacks on women in the East End, only to allegedly die in prison before he could face trial. But the Ripper killings didn't start until 1888. Isla protested weakly, even as her mind made connections she didn't want to acknowledge. "Your father didn't die in Newgate, Isla. He escaped, with help from those who saw potential in his particular talents." Margaret's eyes darkened. There are forces in this world darker than you can imagine. Forces that have been watching London for centuries, waiting for the right moment, the right person. A sound echoed through the building. Footsteps on the floor above, heavy, deliberate footsteps that made the old floorboards creak ominously. "He's here," Margaret whispered, fear crossing her ancient features. "You need to remember, Isla, all of it. Now." The footsteps grew closer, and with them came a wave of memory so powerful it brought Isla to her knees. She saw herself following her father that night in 1888, determined to prove to herself that the rumors weren't true. She watched him enter Miller's Court, heard Mary Jane Kelly's terrified screams, but what she saw when she looked through that window, what she witnessed in that room, "No," she screamed, clutching her head as the full horror of the memory returned. It hadn't just been murder, it had been a ritual ancient and terrible. Her father standing over Mary Kelly's body, drawing symbols in blood, chanting words that made reality itself seem to twist and bend. And then the darkness had come, a living darkness that had poured into him, changing him into something that wasn't human anymore. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. Isla looked up to see a familiar figure standing there. The man from the alley, his scarred face now clearly visible in the dim light. But now she could see beyond the scars, see the features that mirrored her own. "Hello, daughter," Thomas Roberts said softly. "Have you finally remembered your inheritance?" Margaret stepped between them, her frail body somehow radiating power. "She's not yours anymore, Thomas. The Circle made a mistake when they chose you. We won't let it happen again." Thomas laughed, the sound echoing unnaturally through the building. "The Circle? Those doddering old fools who thought they could control what they unleashed?" He took a step forward, and the shadows seemed to move with him. They wanted to create a legend, to feed the darkness that sleeps beneath London's streets, and they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Isla's mind reeled with the implications. The Ripper murders hadn't been random acts of violence. They had been part of something larger, something orchestrated by this mysterious circle, and her father had been their chosen instrument, transformed by ancient magic into a vessel for something inhuman. But why? She managed to ask, her voice shaking. "Why show yourself to me now after all these years?" Her father's smile was terrible to behold. "Because, my dear, the ritual wasn't completed. Mary Kelly was only the beginning. The darkness is hungry, Isla, and it's chosen a new vessel." His eyes locked with hers. Like father, like daughter, The shadows around him began to writhe and twist, reaching out toward her with tendrils of pure darkness. Isla felt something stir inside her, something that had been sleeping for years, waiting to be awakened. She realized with horror that she could feel the darkness calling to her, singing in her blood. Margaret's hand gripped her arm. "You have a choice, Isla. You always have a choice." But did she? As the shadows crept closer and her father's laughter filled the air, Isla wasn't so sure. The darkness was rising, and with it the truth about who and what she really was. The shadows writhed around them like living things, their dark tendrils reaching out with hungry purpose. In the dim light of Miller's Court, Isla stood frozen between her father, the man who had become Jack the Ripper, and Margaret Nagle, the mysterious woman who seemed to be her only ally in this nightmare. The choice before her seemed impossible: embrace the darkness that ran in her blood, or fight against a destiny that had been waiting for her since that terrible night in 1888. "The darkness isn't just calling to you, Isla," Thomas Roberts said, his voice carrying an otherworldly resonance that made the floorboards vibrate beneath their feet. "It's part of you. It always has been. Why do you think you've survived all these years on these streets when so many others haven't?" Isla's mind raced back through the years of poverty and hardship after her husband's death. She had always attributed her survival to luck and determination, but now she remembered the nights when potential attackers had suddenly turned away from her, their eyes wide with inexplicable fear. The times when she had found food or shelter just when she needed it most, as if the very shadows of Whitechapel had been protecting her. "The Circle chose our family for a reason," Thomas continued, taking another step down the creaking stairs. "We have old blood, Isla. Blood that remembers when London was young, when darker gods ruled these lands. The Ripper wasn't just a murderer. He was a key to awakening something ancient, something that has slept beneath these streets for centuries." Margaret's grip on Isla's arm tightened. "Don't listen to him, child. The Circle was wrong. They thought they could control the darkness, use it to reshape the world, but darkness can never be controlled. It can only consume." A sudden gust of wind howled through the building's broken windows, carrying with it the sounds of screaming, distant echoes of that terrible night when Mary Kelly had died. But there were other screams too, older ones, reaching back through centuries of London's bloody history. "Show her," Thomas commanded, and the shadows responded. They swirled around Isla like a tempest, and suddenly she was no longer in Miller's Court. She was everywhere at once, witnessing London's dark history unfold before her eyes. She saw ancient druids performing sacrifices on what would become Tower Hill. She watched as plague doctors wore masks to hide their true, inhuman faces as they harvested souls during the Great Sickness. She witnessed witch hunters who were themselves servants of darker powers than any witch had ever dreamed of controlling. And through it all, she saw her own family line, ancestors who had walked in shadow, who had kept old secrets and performed older rituals. The darkness wasn't just calling to her, it was returning to her like a prodigal child coming home. "Stop!" she screamed, and to her surprise, the vision ceased immediately. The shadows retreated, responding to her command as naturally as her own limbs. The realization of what this meant hit her like a physical blow. Thomas smiled, and for a moment she could see past the scarred face to the father she remembered from her childhood. "You see, the power is already yours. All you have to do is embrace it. and become a murderer like you? Isla spat, even as she felt the darkness pulse within her, hungry and eager. Those women weren't murdered, Isla, they were sacrificed. Each death was a key, turning a lock that has kept the old powers bound for too long. Mary Kelly should have been the final key, but something went wrong that night. When you saw me, when you recognized what was happening, he paused, his eyes glowing with an inner fire. Your presence changed everything. The ritual was incomplete. The circle has waited 35 years for this moment. Margaret interjected, her voice urgent. They've been watching you, Isla, waiting for the darkness to mature within you. Your father was only the beginning. They mean for you to finish what he started. As if in response to Margaret's words, the front door of Miller's Court burst open. 3 figures entered wearing long robes that seemed to be made of living shadow. Their faces were hidden beneath deep hoods, but Isla could feel their ancient, hungry gazes fixed upon her. The time has come, one of them spoke, its voice like stone grinding against stone. The daughter of the Ripper must take her place in the grand design. Isla felt the darkness inside her surge in response to their presence. Images flashed through her mind, visions of herself wielding powers beyond imagination, commanding the very shadows that had haunted London's streets. She could be more than just a survivor. She could be a queen of the darkness. But with these visions came others, the faces of innocent women, their lives cut short to feed an ancient hunger. The terror in Mary Kelly's eyes in those final moments, the weight of centuries of blood and sacrifice. You have until midnight to make your choice, Thomas said softly. Embrace your destiny or watch as the darkness finds another vessel, someone who won't hesitate to spill the blood necessary to complete what I began. The hooded figures moved closer, their very presence making the air grow thick and cold. The old gods stir in their sleep, they intoned in unison. London streets grow hungry once again. Only blood can satisfy them. Only sacrifice can keep them sleeping. Margaret's hand found Isla's again, and suddenly a warm light seemed to push back the encroaching shadows. There's always a choice, she whispered. Your father forgot that, but you don't have to. The building groaned around them, as if the very walls were responding to the gathering power. Outside, the bells of Christ Church Spitalfields began to toll, counting down the hours until midnight, until Isla's choice would seal not only her fate, but the fate of London itself. Thomas spread his arms wide and the shadows danced around him like eager servants. Come, daughter, let me show you everything you were meant to be. Let me teach you the true power of the darkness that flows in your veins. Isla looked between her father and the hooded figures, then back to Margaret's concerned face. The darkness inside her surged and retreated like a tide, calling her to embrace it even as something deeper, something fundamentally human, recoiled from its touch. Time was running out. By midnight, she would have to choose: become the vessel for an ancient darkness and complete the ritual her father had begun, or fight against her own blood, her own nature, to prevent an evil older than London itself from fully awakening. And somewhere in the streets below, the shadows waited, hungry for her decision. The bells of Christ Church Spitalfields continued their mournful toll as darkness fell over London. Each resonant strike seemed to vibrate through Isla's very being, the darkness within her responding to their ancient song. Miller's Court had become a battlefield of shadows, with Isla at its center, caught between two impossible choices. Through the grimy windows, she could see the last rays of sunlight dying in the west. Soon it would be night, and with darkness would come her moment of decision. The hooded figures of the circle had withdrawn to the corners of the room, their presence like a weight pressing against her consciousness. Her father, Thomas Roberts, Jack the Ripper himself, stood waiting on the stairs while Margaret Nagle remained by her side, a faint glimmer of light in the gathering gloom. "Let me show you the truth," Thomas said, extending his hand. "Let me show you what the circle has been preparing for all these years." Before Margaret could stop her, Isla found herself stepping forward, taking her father's hand. The moment their skin touched, the world dissolved into darkness. She was falling through time, through memory, through the very fabric of reality itself. She saw London as it had been centuries ago, when the old gods still walked its streets openly. She saw the circle here in its early days, learned men and women who had discovered that the city itself was built upon layers of power, ley lines of ancient force that could be tapped through ritual and sacrifice. She watched as they made their first bargain with the darkness, promising it blood in exchange for power. But it wasn't enough. The darkness was hungry, always hungry, and as London grew, so did its appetite. The circle needed a vessel, someone who could channel the darkness, control it, use it to keep the old powers sleeping beneath the city's streets. They had searched for centuries, testing bloodlines, performing rituals, until finally they found me. Thomas's voice echoed through. The vision, they saw the potential in our bloodline, the old power that still ran in our veins. But I was only the beginning. They knew that the true vessel would be my child, you, Isla. You were bred for this, shaped for this moment, since before you were born. The vision shifted, and Isla saw herself as an infant. Hooded figures performing dark rituals over her cradle while her mother slept. Unaware, she saw the circle watching her grow, manipulating events to guide her path. Even her husband's death had been their doing, ensuring she would be alone and vulnerable when the time came. "No," she whispered, trying to pull away from the visions, but they kept coming. She saw the truth behind the Ripper murders, each victim chosen not randomly, but for their connection to the old powers. Each death had been a key, turning locks that had kept the darkness bound. But Mary had been different. She had been a guardian, one of those who had fought to keep the old powers sleeping. Her death should have broken the final seal, but when Isla had witnessed the ritual, her presence had changed everything. "Your blood recognized the power," Thomas explained. "It reached out, took part of the darkness into itself. That's why the ritual failed, because you were meant to be its true vessel, not me." The vision released her, and Isla found herself back in Miller's Court, gasping for breath. The hooded figures had drawn closer, their anticipation palpable in the air. "The time has come," they intoned. "The vessel must choose." But something had changed during the vision. Isla had seen something in those ancient memories that the others had missed, a truth hidden beneath centuries of darkness and deception. She turned to Margaret, whose eyes widened in recognition. "You knew," Isla said softly. "You knew all along what they really were." Margaret nodded slowly. "I was hoping you would see it. The circle isn't what they claim to be. They don't keep the darkness bound. They feed it, strengthen it, all while pretending to be London's protectors." Thomas laughed, the sound echoing unnaturally through the building. "Of course they do. That was always the bargain. The darkness gives them power, and they give it sacrifice, an arrangement as old as the city itself. But it's more than that, isn't it? Isla said, her voice growing stronger as the truth crystallized in her mind. I saw it in the visions. The circle doesn't serve London. They serve something else. Something that's been using the darkness all along. The hooded figures went very still. Clever girl, one of them hissed, its voice no longer human. But it makes no difference. Tara, the choice remains the same. Embrace the darkness or watch as we find another vessel, one who will spill rivers of blood in your place. Isla felt the darkness inside her surge, responding to their presence, but now she understood it differently. The power in her blood wasn't meant to serve the darkness. It was meant to fight it. Her presence at Mary Kelly's death hadn't been an accident, it had been providence. The old powers hadn't chosen her as a vessel for darkness, but as a weapon against it. You're wrong, she said, standing straighter. The choice isn't between embracing darkness or watching others suffer. The choice is whether to keep feeding an ancient lie or to finally expose the truth. The hooded figures moved with inhuman speed, shadows extending from their robes like claws, but Isla was ready. The power in her blood responded to her will, not as a dark and hungry thing, but as a light that had been waiting centuries to shine. Thomas screamed in rage, the darkness around him writhing. You fool! You have no idea what you're doing. But she did. For the first time since this nightmare began, Isla knew exactly what she had to do. The darkness inside her wasn't a curse. It was a gift, passed down through generations of her family, waiting for someone strong enough to use it for its true purpose. As midnight approached and the final confrontation began, the fate of not just London, but the world itself hung in the balance. The truth about the circle, about Jack the Ripper, about the very nature of the darkness itself was about to be revealed, and Isla Roberts, daughter of the Ripper, last guardian of an ancient power, stood ready to face her destiny. As the final bell toll of midnight echoed through the streets of Whitechapel, Miller's Court erupted into chaos. The hooded figures of the circle revealed their true forms at last, ancient, twisted beings that had hidden behind human guise for centuries. Their robes fell away like smoke, revealing bodies of living shadow, their eyes burning with the hungry fire of stars that had died eons ago. Thomas Roberts, the man who had been Jack the Ripper, let out an inhuman roar as the darkness that had possessed him for so long responded to their transformation. The shadows around him writhed and twisted, turning the air itself into a maelstrom of darkness. But Isla stood her ground, the power in her blood burning bright against the encroaching dark. You don't understand what you're fighting against, Thomas snarled, his face contorting with rage and desperation. The darkness is all that keeps them bound. Without it, they'll wake, all of them. No, Margaret said, her frail form suddenly radiating with its own inner light. That's the lie they've been telling for centuries. The darkness doesn't bind them, it feeds them, makes them stronger. Each sacrifice, each ritual has been preparing for their return. The truth of it resonated through Isla's very being. The Circle wasn't a group of mystics protecting London from ancient evils. They were the servants of those very powers, cultivating darkness like farmers tending a crop. And now, after centuries of preparation, they were ready to harvest. One of the shadow beings laughed, the sound like breaking glass. Clever humans to finally understand, but it makes no difference. The seals are weakening, The old ones stir in their sleep. Soon they will wake, and this city, this world, will be remade in their image. Isla felt the power inside her surge, no longer a darkness to be feared, but a light that had been waiting for this moment. She understood now why she had been chosen, why her bloodline had been watched for so long. The Circle hadn't bred her to be their vessel. They had accidentally created their own destruction. The Ripper murders, she said, pieces falling into place. They weren't just sacrifices, you were marking points of power, creating a pattern, a key. Thomas finished, his voice carrying a hint of his old self, a key to unlock the gates that have kept them bound. My murders were meant to start the pattern. You were meant to complete it. The shadow beings moved closer, their forms rippling with anticipation. The pattern must be completed, if not by you, then by another. The old ones will have their sacrifice. But Isla saw something else in the pattern they had created. Not just a key to unlock ancient bonds, but a circuit that could be closed in another way. The points of power marked by the Ripper murders could be used to channel energy in a different direction, but the price would be unimaginable. Margaret seemed to read her thoughts. It would take a power greater than darkness, she warned, a willing sacrifice freely given by one who carries the old blood. No! Thomas shouted, understanding dawning in his eyes. Isla, don't! The power would tear you apart. The shadow beings rushed forward, finally sensing her intention, but they were too late. Isla had already made her choice. The power in her blood, not darkness, but the pure force of life itself, responded to her call. Light erupted from her body, following the pattern laid down by the Ripper murders, but reversing its flow. Turning a key meant to unlock into a seal meant to bind. The shadow beings screamed in rage and terror as the light touched them. Isla felt her father's darkness fighting against her power, felt the Circle's centuries of careful planning unraveling in moments, but the price was beyond anything she had imagined. Each pulse of power tore at her very essence, burning away pieces of her soul. The pattern must be completed, she gasped, echoing their words but giving them new meaning. A sacrifice freely given to bind instead of release. Thomas reached for her, his face transforming from rage to anguish. Daughter, please. But it was too late. The power flowing through Isla reached its peak, turning her into a beacon of pure light that illuminated every shadow in Whitechapel. The shadow beings howled as they were caught in its radiance, their ancient forms burning away like mist in the morning sun. The darkness that had possessed Thomas for so long was torn from him, leaving him human and broken, falling to his knees with tears streaming down his face. In that final moment of clarity, as her sacrifice neared completion, Isla saw the truth of everything. The darkness had never been meant to rule. It had been meant to teach humanity how to fight against it. Every generation, every test, every ritual had been leading to this moment, creating someone strong enough to make the ultimate choice. The light reached its crescendo, and Isla felt herself beginning to fade. But as her physical form dissolved into pure energy, she saw something that made her smile. Faces in the light, familiar faces, Mary Kelly and the other victims of Jack. The Ripper, no longer trapped in darkness, but transformed into guardians of the light she had unleashed. It's all right, love, Mary's voice echoed in her mind. You've done it. The pattern is complete. The last thing Isla saw was her father's face, cleaned of shadows at last, showing not the monster he had been, but the man he might have been. I'm sorry, he whispered. I understand now. Then the light took her completely, and Isla Roberts ceased to exist as a mortal being. But she didn't die, she transformed. Her sacrifice had not just blocked the return of ancient evils, it had created something new. The power in her blood, freely given instead of taken, became a new kind of guardian for London streets. They say that on dark nights in Whitechapel, when the fog rolls in and shadows threaten to overwhelm the light, a presence can be felt, not a darkness that haunts, but a light that protects. Some say they've seen a woman in white walking the streets where Jack the Ripper once prowled, her presence bringing comfort instead of fear. And in the years that followed, when other dark powers tried to rise, they found themselves facing not the weak defenses of the old circle, but a new kind of guardian, one born of sacrifice and love rather than power and fear. The darkness never truly died, but neither did the light that Isla Roberts had brought into the world. Margaret Nagle, who survived that night to become the keeper of this truth, would often tell those who asked about the Ripper that every darkness holds within it the seeds of light, if only someone is brave enough to nurture them instead of fear them. And in the end, that was Isla's greatest victory, not just defeating the darkness, but showing that even in the blackest night, in the most corrupted blood, in the darkest legacy, there exists the potential for redemption. Her sacrifice became not an end, but a beginning, a light that would shine through London's darkest nights for generations to come.